Your other reading from the Old Testament comes from Genesis chapter 12. Here now, verses 1 through 9. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Abram took his wife Sarai and his brother's son Lot, and all the possessions that they had gathered, and the persons whom they had acquired in Haran, and they set forth to go to the land of Canaan. When they had come to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to a place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. At that time the Canaanites were in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he moved on to the hill country on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west end and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and invoked the name of the Lord. And Abram journeyed on by stages toward the Negeb. This is the word of the Lord. So we are back to Bible synopsis series, big overview series on books of the Bible. I'm excited to be back doing that. That's really more of my wheelhouse. That's what I get excited by the opportunity to do. And I really hope that in my ministry I can help the Bible to come alive to people and help people to appreciate and really enjoy the word of the Lord. And so whenever I get the chance to kind of introduce a book to people in a way that they can go back to it and read it in a more full way, I want to do that. That's what we're going to be doing with this series through Lent on Saga Genesis. Now, one of the key ideas, I think one of the most helpful tools we have to experiencing and enjoying the Bible is appreciating the context and the genre of a particular book. To not read the whole Bible the same way when different books of the Bible are written in different genres and different styles and meant to be read with a different frame of mind. And so, when last we were in Genesis, way back in 2018, y'all were so young then, we did chapters 1 through 9, and I encouraged us to think of those as myths. We called the series Mythic Genesis, and I clarified that by myths I don't mean stories that aren't true. In fact, I think that the stories in Genesis 1 through 9 are true. But myths are stories that are filled with significance and symbolic meaning in addition to their literal significance and literal meaning. So for instance, we have a myth in our culture that's arisen during our lifetimes. There's this thing, have you heard this myth called DNA? Right? Now DNA is real. It literally exists. And we discovered it. But first of all, it does not look like you think it looks, right? You haven't seen DNA. You've seen a model of it. Because atoms and molecules aren't really brightly colored like that, and they aren't really... And also the way we talk about DNA, it's become a yarn. It's become a story that we tell over and over. So we can talk about things that are in the DNA of various things. If they're intrinsic to the identity, it's in the DNA, right? There was an old joke. Mrs. Sanders was taking a walk with her two sons, and somebody approached her and said, "Oh, what adorable kids. How old are they?" And she said, "The doctor is 5 and the lawyer is 7. right? Some things are just in your DNA. It's just true. That's a lawyer. It's a part of it. We talk about the DNA of this church when we talk about these 5 steps, this 5-step sequence of how churches grow: prayer and invitation and multiplication. We hope to build these things into our DNA, but not literally, mythologically, in that true sense that is truer than true. But in chapter 11, the genre changes. In the same scroll, the same book of Genesis, we go from telling these compact, ancient stories about prehistory to all of a sudden telling a very, very long story about a family. And I'm going to argue that what we have now is a saga, a very long-form family adventure. But it's not a mistake that they're bound in the same volume. I'm not saying that we ought to chop off at chapter 9, because we begin with myths, and the myths flow into the saga, and the saga also becomes a myth. It becomes one of these stories that we tell, that defines us, that creates meaning for us and truth beyond its literal meaning. But all of a sudden, it's this whole saga. And it is, in fact, we'll learn, an unending saga. So that, if you look at Genesis chapter 8, Noah's Ark, that's one story. If you look at Genesis chapter 12, Abram walks past some trees, that is not one story. That is a part of a long saga. So I want to have some audience participation. I want to help us to understand what I'm talking about, because of course I've got some sagas in my mind. What are some sagas that you're aware of, that you're familiar with, or that you've enjoyed, or at least that you've heard of? Go ahead, Isa. Joseph? Yeah, so Joseph's going to show up later in the book. He's kind of got a saga of his own, so to speak. What about in the secular world, or in the world beyond the Bible? Can you think of a saga? Star Wars. I think you stole Heather's one there. Oh, go ahead. Sorry? Twilight. Yes, the Twilight saga, right? There are 6 books to Twilight? There are 4 books to Twilight, but we're following this story. Bella's got, she breaks up with the vampire, and then she gets with the werewolf, and we're just building up continuing stories. Yes, Star Wars, which is now, I think, 12 movies, plus the TV shows, plus the merchandise. Yeah, go ahead. Harry Potter is a great saga. Harry Potter is, I would argue, a very culturally important saga if you're living in Orlando, the home of Harry Potter world, the wizarding world of Harry Potter. People come from far and wide to visit the location of the Harry Potter saga. And that's been an important formative series for people that are my age who grew up with it. NCIS? I'm not a fan, but it's certainly long. It certainly has gone on for a while. Does NCIS, I'm curious, because a number of those crime shows, the cast will rotate. It stayed consistent in NCIS? They combine them sometimes. Okay, because there's an NCIS San Diego and okay. Oh, so there's these multiple families that are interconnected. Oh, that is very Sagagian. That is so. I used to be a fan of CSI, and I know CSI had that kind of, people leave the program and people enter the program, and there's this, but we've got to follow all of it to keep up with it. I think Roots, if you're familiar with Roots, that's a great saga that's been really influential. Not you, Sherry. Downton Abbey, yes. Yes, 5 seasons in a movie. You get Downton Abbey going.
I'm dating myself to
Dallas.
Dallas.
That's a classic. That's Dallas. Yeah, the dynasty. Speaking of dynasties, Godfather. Yeah? How does the protagonist die in the first movie and you make 2 more movies? Well, because it's a saga, because it's not just about the one protagonist. Great examples. So we're at the beginning of the saga. And that's, I mean, if you get nothing else out of this sermon, I hope you get that. I hope you get the invitation to read the end of Genesis chapter 11 to Genesis 50 in that way. Read it like you would watch The Godfather or like you would watch NCIS. Notice how the strands follow through and experience the story as a whole, as a long... I got to mention Tolstoy. The Russians are great at sagas. I know we love our Russian neighbors. We've got a Russian church that meets here. But it's a fact, Russia has a very long and very cold winter. And so those people are very able to sit and read very long, very boring books that are excellent quality of art, but also very long. So Tolstoy, War and Peace, Dostoevsky, those kinds of stories. If you read Genesis 11 through 50 like you would read a Russian novel, you'll find a new layer of meaning and a new layer of enjoyment that shows up. And what happens at the beginning of our saga, actually, even before chapter 12, we meet Terah, who leaves Ur with his family, including his 2 grown sons, one of which is named Abram. And Terah is leaving this major city. He's leaving Ur in the Chaldees, in Sumer or in Babylon. And he's going to head to Canaan. And before we even really begin, Terah dies. Off screen. It's like, Star Wars, the opening crawl. It's Terah is dead. It is a period of disorder. We have to decide what we are going to do next because we are in Haran. And all of a sudden, God speaks to Abraham. That's Abraham's call to adventure. God speaks to Abraham and says, keep going. Don't stop where your father stopped in Haran, but travel onward and leave the nation entirely. Leave your father's nation and your father's house and go on a grand adventure. Whenever we read sagas, whenever we read these great epic heroic tales, there is this call to adventure. There is something that sets the family apart. There's something that sets the action of the story in motion. And it can be a story that continues for generations. And this is that moment for Abram. One of my favorite depictions of it comes from The Lord of the Rings. Have you seen the Lord of the Rings movies or read the books? There's this moment in Lord of the Rings where Frodo and Sam and Merry and Pippin are leaving, and they're exiting the Shire, this safe place that they've lived all their lives, and all of a sudden Sam stops. And Frodo says, "What's wrong, Sam? What's happened?" And he says, "If I take one more step, it'll be the farthest from home I've ever been." What's that moment when you take the one step? It's one thing to leave Ur and go to Hebron. It's another thing to keep going past Hebron, to cross the threshold. Joseph Campbell, who is a brilliant sociologist and student of global stories and myths, has identified the hero's journey. And he identifies that no matter what story we're telling, we see the same kind of pattern. There's a call to adventure, there's an interaction with an old wizard, there's an entrance into the belly of the beast, usually represented as some kind of death, followed by a resurrection, and then an encounter with God, and then a return to bestow boons on your fellow man. And so he says that these are representative of coming-of-age stories, that we tell these stories over and over, and that becomes the plot of Star Wars, and it becomes the plot of the Avengers, and it becomes the plot of Harry Potter, as well as the plot of King Arthur, as well as the plot of Thor and Loki and Quetzalcoatl and people who've never spoken to each other telling the same story. And he says they're telling it because there's some deep truth to it, and he suspects that it has to do with coming of age, with puberty. That we all have to find a moment where we leave behind what we used to be and we enter into adulthood. And so we tell these threshold stories. Abram is 75. I think that's interesting. The Bible says that's a good time to start an adventure. He's a young man. He's fresh. He's ready. He's going to begin a new thing. And he does a thing that for the ancient world, I mean, I'm afraid we would miss how kind of weird that is. You know, Hebron is about 350 miles walking to the Negev. And if we were to walk from here 350 miles, no big deal. You know, they're still going to have Sunoco gas stations, and we've got the same law and order and civics and government. That just wasn't the case back then. If you leave the walls of your city, you're in the wilderness. And if you leave the nation, you don't know what law rules. And not only that, but Ur of the Chaldees, I mean, that's like the cradle of human civilization, baby. That's Rome before Rome. They had the Babylonians, they had irrigation, they had hanging gardens, they had cool stuff. It's a developed, it's a modern, I mean, modern by standards, but still, it's a civilization. It would be the equivalent of like living and growing up in Los Angeles, right? It's not the biggest city, but it's big. Center of art and culture and influence and money and power. And then thinking, yeah, you know, I'm going to leave. Maybe I'll travel to like Death Valley in the middle of the Mojave Desert. No, wait a second. I'm instead going to travel west into like the middle of the Pacific Ocean. I'm going to go to where there's just nothing. And God says, it's okay. I'm going to give you land. Like people just don't go that way. Why would you go to the Negev? I mean, even today, the Negev it's at the southern part of Israel. It's not a very important place. And the people there, I mean, they're the sea peoples. We don't trust them. They're kind of like pirates. But Abram believes God, and he travels. And when he does, he takes on a new identity. Because the people who do that, the people who leave the city and they go out, they're wanderers. They just become, that's you, the new thing. You're a traveler now. You've traveled, you've changed who you are. And we have a word for that kind of traveler. It's the word Hebrew. The word in Hebrew for Hebrew is ivri. It's one who crosses over. One who passes the threshold, who goes over the threshold, becomes a wanderer. I want us to apply this. I want us to think about this moment when we stand on thresholds in our lives. Can you remember a time when you've been on a threshold like Abraham? Can you think of a moment in your life? I'm at a moment in my life right now where I'm standing on a threshold. I'm about to change my identity to become a parent, become a father. That's going to be a major change of everything that I am. And what's that like? You know, when we read the Bible, we want to apply it to our lives. And when we read Genesis, there are a couple of bad habits that we may get into that I want us to avoid. First of all, I don't want us to make these stories into morality tales. Sometimes I feel like I've been taught to treat Abraham and Isaac and Jacob as kind of like ancient, religiousified Goofus and Gallant, right? Abraham does this, but Lot does that. That's not how these stories are. Abraham's a real person who does sometimes good things and sometimes bad things, and we're supposed to experience them the way we would experience an enthralling character in a great piece of literature. I also want to resist another potential way sometimes we've applied the Old Testament, which is to simply mine the material for Jesus stuff, right? As if the whole classic story that exists is nothing but dirt for us to get through that hides the good nuggets that have to do with New Testament truth. It is true that there are nuggets of New Testament truth in the Old Testament, but that's not what the Old Testament is there for. The Old Testament is the Old Testament, and it is valuable as a whole, and part of its value contains the reality that Jesus is glorified without decoding anything. That the stories we hear about the God who relates and the God who loves applies to us. But I do want to relate with the character the way we would relate with Harry Potter, who gets his letter, and all of a sudden life will never be the same because I got my Hogwarts letter, right? The way we would relate with the Corleones, and all of a sudden drugs have become an issue in crime families, and we've got to decide whether we're going to traffic drugs or not. What does it mean to you to cross a threshold? How is the threshold that Abram crossed similar to the threshold the fisherman crossed? When Abraham left his nation and became a Hebrew, and the fishermen left their nets and became disciples. We're crossing a threshold as a church. We are transitioning and becoming an outward-focused church. A church that develops and grows people by reaching out. And we have a threshold step for that. Our first step, which is a commitment to pray for 2 or more people who need to know God in a way they haven't known God before. And so, when we choose to pray, we are choosing to answer the call to adventure. What's your posture look like for that? What do you think? I mean, it doesn't say much about Abram's posture here. What do you suppose his posture was? And notice that how you read that will probably say more about you than it does about Abram. Right? We're filling in the blanks. Was Abram like Sam, who had some trepidation, had some concern, but also some excitement? Or was Abram more like Bilbo, who took his ticket and ran and said, "Oh, I'm going on an adventure!" And how do you feel when you embark on a new adventure? Is there a confusion or a feeling of unease about what this is about and what lays beyond? God offers some reassurance. And his reassurance to Abram comes in the form of a promise that'll be strengthened and revisited throughout this Genesis saga. I call it the PLR promise. That makes it easier for me to remember. PLR, people, land, and relationship. God says, Abram, if you're concerned, if you're not sure, know that P, L, and R are true. P is for people. Abram, I will make you a great nation. You will have people. Your offspring will outnumber the stars of the sky, he says later. You're going to be my people. The L is for land. He says at the end of our reading today, I will give you this land the land that the Canaanites inhabit. This will be your land and relationship. I will bless you, and you will be a blessing. And those who curse you, I will curse. That you'll be a people, that you'll have a place to live, and that you will exist in a special relationship with me, your God. Notice what this promise is not. God does not promise Abram eternal salvation. Abram doesn't have those categories. He's not thinking in those terms. What he wants is to live a good life and to be remembered by his offspring. So God says, you'll have sons and daughters, and they will have a place to live, and I will be there. But the story of the PLR promise is going to continue right on through Jesus Christ. Actually, the salvation expectation, it doesn't supersede or get added on to the PLR promise, but it is an extension of it. What happens is, as generations pass and Abraham has descendants and descendants and descendants, eventually those descendants are unfaithful and they're carried off into captivity. And the prophet doesn't say, I have magical future-seeing powers and I've seen the future, so therefore Jesus will come. The prophet says, God promised. And God is faithful. God said that we would be a people, and we would have a land, and we would exist in relationship with Him. We broke that relationship, but one day it's going to be restored. We lost that land, but one day it's going to be restored because God promised. And God keeps His promises. I know that a Savior will come. There will be a Messiah because of this promise. And so this reality of eternal salvation that we all hope for came true and is true out of this one step, this one threshold, this one man, an imperfect man who decided to follow, who decided to go. You will be my people, and I will be your God, and I will bring you into the land that I will show you if you trust me. I believe that we can claim that promise for ourselves today as people of God, as sons of Abraham. I will multiply you. I will be with you. And I will provide for you a home if you trust me. The saga continues, and we will learn about Abraham's son, Isaac, next week. But in the meantime, I think it's appropriate that we celebrate with the Lord's Supper. No matter what shape your saga takes, whether you're at the beginning, the middle, or the end of your saga right now, whether you, like Abram, are about to set forth on an epic journey that will bless all nations with people, land, and relationship, or whether you, like Joshua, are going to enter into the promised land that has been long anticipated, or whether you have to fight traffic and get to Publix, I hope you will have this blessing to take with you, that you will be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid, for the Lord your God will go with you wherever you go. Amen.